Do you remember what you were going to do that night? Ethan's voice trembled. I wasn't planning to wake up, he answered quietly, eyes locked on the note in his hand. He checked into the hotel with no luggage. No return ticket, not even a plan to check out alive. But when Ethan slid open his wallet and unfolded a torn, rain-stained note, he whispered, This, this stopped me from ending everything. It wasn't a doctor who saved him, not a therapist. It was a tired girl behind a flickering front desk, who wrote 12 words she didn't think would matter. And those 12 words changed two lives forever. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. It painted the narrow streets in streaks of silver, dripping from the awnings of shuttered shops and empty alleyways. Inside the small, dimly lit hotel tucked between forgotten buildings, Rachel Monroe sat behind the front desk, her fingers nervously tapping the outdated keyboard. She was filling in for her best friend Jenna, who had called in sick just 2 hours earlier with a hoarse, feverish voice and a desperate plea. Rachel hadn't hesitated. She needed the extra income. College tuition was due, her bookstore shifts had been cut, and her part-time job at the cafe barely covered rent. So here she was, on a cold, rainy night, surrounded by flickering lights and the soft hum of loneliness. The hotel lobby was old but clean, lined with worn carpets and brass fixtures that had lost their shine. A ticking wall clock above her counted down the slow minutes. Just when the silence began to press in too tightly, the front door chimed open. A gust of wet wind swept in with a man, tall, soaked to the bone, his black coat dripping water onto the tile floor. He stood just inside the entrance, unmoving for a second, as if gathering strength. Rachel looked up, startled, then stood politely. "Good evening," she said, forcing a smile. "Do you have a reservation?" The man didn't respond right away. He looked not at her, but through her. His eyes, hollow, distant, were the kind you'd see on someone who'd lost something they could never recover. Finally he spoke, voice low and raspy. "I think I called earlier. The name's Ethan Kingsley." She nodded, typing quickly, her fingers flying over keys she barely knew. "Yes, room 204. One night, king bed, late checkout." He didn't react, just reached for the key card she extended, his fingers barely brushing hers. There was no thank you, no smile. But then, just before he stepped into the elevator, he paused. Rachel watched him from behind the desk. His back was turned, still, rigid. For 5 long seconds, he didn't move. Then he slowly turned his head, just enough for her to see his profile. Their eyes met for a single moment, his gaze empty and unreadable. Then he vanished behind the closing elevator doors. Rachel exhaled slowly, unsure why her chest felt tight. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Something quieter, heavier, like watching someone drowning. But they were standing on dry land. She tried to shake it off, returning to the desk, flipping idly through an old magazine. But the image of Ethan Kingsley stayed with her. The weight in his eyes, the stillness in his posture, the silence that followed him into the room. She didn't know why, but something about him unsettled her deeply. And the night was only beginning. The rain hadn't let up. It tapped steadily on the lobby windows like 1,000 whispered secrets. Rachel sat curled in the old leather chair behind the reception desk, her shift dragging toward midnight. The hotel had grown quiet again. Most guests were already in their rooms, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock above her. She stretched her aching legs and stood, glancing toward the glass doors at the front of the building. Something caught her eye, a vague figure just outside, barely visible through the sheeting rain. Narrowing her eyes, she moved closer to the glass. There on the balcony outside room 204 sat Ethan Kingsley. He wasn't under the overhang. He had no umbrella. He wasn't on his phone or smoking. He was just sitting, still, drenched, head bowed, shoulders slumped, like a statue left out in the storm. Rachel's breath caught. It had been over an hour since he checked in. What was he doing out there? Her fingers curled around the edge of the reception counter. She felt something stir in her chest, a tension, a sorrow she couldn't name. Not fear, not exactly. It was the kind of ache you feel when you recognize something in someone else, something you felt yourself. She thought of nights when she couldn't sleep, staring at her cracked ceiling, wishing life would pause. She'd seen that look before, in mirrors, on her own face, in her own silences. She wanted to go to him, ask if he was okay, offer a towel, maybe tea, but she didn't move. Something deeper told her this wasn't a moment to interrupt. It was a moment to understand. Instead, she turned back to the desk. The cheap notepad sat beside the landline. Slowly, almost without thinking, she tore a small square from the corner, picked up a pen. She stared at the blank scrap for a moment, heart pounding, then began to write. If you are still alive today, you are braver than you think. 12 words. Not much, but they were true, and sometimes truth didn't need to be dressed up. She folded the note carefully, the paper already soft from her fingertips. For a moment she sat there, holding it in her palm like it was something fragile, like a seed that might grow if planted right. Just before dawn, Rachel left the front desk quietly. The hallway carpet muffled her footsteps. When she reached room 204, she crouched, exhaled, and with a shaky hand, slid the folded note under the door. She stood, waited, nothing. No sound inside, no movement. She didn't knock. She just stared at the number on the door for a moment longer, her heart thudding in her chest, then turned and walked away. The rain had stopped by morning, but Rachel's thoughts hadn't. She stayed past the end of her shift, sipping stale coffee, pretending to read the local newspaper. Part of her was waiting, hoping, but Ethan never came down. When Jenna returned and took over the desk, Rachel asked, casually, trying to mask the hope in her voice, if room 204 had checked out. Jenna nodded. Yeah, quiet guy. Came down right before sunrise. Just handed me the key and left. Didn't say a word. No message. No thank you. No sign that he'd even seen the note. Rachel forced a smile and nodded, but inside her chest, something hollow opened. She had told herself not to expect anything, and yet, as she stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the silence he left behind clung to her, like a question unanswered. Like a door that had closed too gently to know if it ever opened at all. She didn't know it yet, but those 12 words had already done what they were meant to do. They had reached a man on the edge. 2 months had passed since that rainy night. Life for Rachel Monroe hadn't gotten easier. The hours at the bookstore had been cut again. The cafe was short-staffed and overworked. Tuition deadlines loomed like storm clouds, and her bank account seemed to shrink faster than her breath on cold mornings. She was barely keeping up, her days a blur of shifts, study, and exhaustion. She had almost forgotten about Ethan Kingsley. Almost, until one gray morning, while sipping her third reheated cup of coffee, she opened her email and froze. Subject, employment opportunity, assistant to executive director sender. Ethereum Technologies. She blinked. Ethereum? One of the top health tech firms in the country? She had never applied to them. Never even visited their site beyond glancing at headlines about innovation in AI-driven implants. At first, she assumed it was spam, but her name was spelled correctly. The message referenced details only someone close to her would know. Her university, her part-time schedule, even a soft mention of her compassion as a trait valued by a mutual contact who requested anonymity. Her stomach flipped. She reread the message 3 times before her fingers dialed the contact number, half expecting a robot on the other end. Instead, a bright voice answered, "Good morning. This is Catherine from Ethereum. Is this Ms. Rachel Monroe?" "Yes," she managed. "We're delighted you received our message. We'd like to invite you to an in-person meeting with our executive director regarding the assistant position. He was very specific about wanting to meet you personally." Rachel's throat tightened. I think there's a mistake. I didn't apply." "Actually," Catherine replied gently, "you were referred." 3 days later, Rachel stood in the pristine marble lobby of Ethereum's headquarters. Her second-hand blazer itched slightly. Her only pair of heels pinched with every step. She kept smoothing her skirt even though no one was looking. An assistant guided her to a private elevator, then down a hushed hallway to a sleek door at the end. "Please wait inside," the woman said with a warm smile. Rachel entered slowly. The office was flooded with soft morning light. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. A modern desk sat near the center, polished walnut, minimal decor. And at the window facing away stood a man in a tailored suit. He turned. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, Ethan Kingsley. But not the man she'd last seen in the rain. This version stood tall, confident, clean-shaven, composed. His eyes, once hollow, now held depth. Still serious but awake. He smiled softly. "Hello, Rachel." "Ah," she blinked, stunned. "You? You work here?" "I run it," he replied gently. "Ethereum's always been mine. I stepped away for a while. I've just returned." I... I don't understand," she said, gripping the strap of her worn purse. Ethan stepped forward slowly. From his inside pocket, he pulled out a small, folded paper, frayed, water-stained, familiar. Rachel's heart skipped. He unfolded it with care. Her handwriting stared back at her. "If you are still alive today, you are braver than you think." "I kept it," he said, voice soft. "I read it 10 times that morning, and for the first time in weeks, I chose to live." The room went still. Rachel's eyes filled, but she said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat tightened too much to speak. Ethan's voice dropped, trembling just slightly. "I was at the end. That night I had no plans to check out. I didn't see a way forward. I didn't feel anything. Not fear, not sadness, just silence." He paused, then looked up at her. "But your words, they didn't try to fix me. They didn't preach or judge. They reminded me that even surviving was an act of courage." Rachel stood frozen, overwhelmed. "I asked the hotel staff for your name," he continued. "I didn't want to interfere with your life until I had something real to offer." He stepped back, motioning to the desk. "This position is yours if you want it, not out of gratitude, not because you saved me, but because I believe your voice matters, and it should be heard in places that make a difference." She swallowed hard. "Why me?" "Because you didn't look away," he said simply. "When I was invisible, you saw me." The silence that followed was full, but not empty. It hummed with the weight of understanding. Rachel walked slowly to the desk, ran her fingers across the walnut edge. She wasn't just the tired girl behind the front desk anymore. She was the reason a man like Ethan Kingsley still stood. And now, the story was only beginning. Working alongside Ethan Kingsley wasn't what Rachel Monroe expected. It was quieter, kinder, and more human than anything she had known before. From the outside, Ethan still looked every bit the accomplished CEO. Composed, thoughtful, respected. But within the private spaces of the office, the ones filled with late evenings, whispered conversations, and shared silences, he was something else entirely. Softer, present, still healing, but no longer hollow. Each day, Ethan and Rachel began to move in a rhythm, not just professionally, but emotionally. At exactly 3:01 p.m., a cup of chamomile tea would appear on Rachel's desk. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a warm cup, placed gently near her notebook, the scent soothing and familiar. She'd never told him outright that she hated caffeine, but once in passing she'd mentioned how she drank chamomile to calm her nerves during exams. He remembered. When it rained, and it often did, Rachel never had to fumble for an umbrella. Ethan would be waiting at the building entrance, already holding one aloft. He wouldn't speak. He'd simply match her stride and walk beside her in comfortable silence. The umbrella always tilted just slightly more toward her side. By the time they reached the door, his shoulders would be damp. Hers never were. It was these small, constant acts that spoke the loudest. He never praised her publicly, but he never let her go unnoticed either. In meetings, he made space for her voice. He'd pause when she hesitated, let her finish when others interrupted, and when she presented ideas, no matter how tentative, he'd look her in the eye and say, with quiet certainty, "Thank you, brave one." The first time he said it, she smiled awkwardly, brushing it off as a reference to the note. But as the weeks passed, the words returned, after long days, successful presentations, or even small victories, like organizing a chaotic project board. And each time the way he said it changed. It wasn't a callback anymore. It was a belief. Rachel had never been called brave before. Not by someone who meant it, not by someone who saw her, not just as competent, but as strong, as capable, as worthy. Slowly, she began to believe it too. After hours, they often lingered in the employee library, helping reshelve books with the volunteer staff. Ethan never announced his presence there. He simply rolled up his sleeves and worked quietly, sorting biographies and laughing when he put them in the wrong section. Sometimes they'd share takeout from a corner food cart. One time, he got chili powder all over his white shirt, and they laughed harder than either of them had in months. There were moments that felt like they could become something more, but neither pushed. There was a line between them, one neither dared to cross, born not of fear, but of respect. As if they both knew healing wasn't complete yet, and love, if it was ever meant to bloom, should only do so between two whole people, not two fractured ones leaning on each other for balance. Still, Rachel no longer felt like a girl looking in from the outside. Not in Ethan's world, not in that office, not when he looked at her with eyes that listened. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged, not because she had earned it with sacrifice or survival, but because someone had finally made space for her, exactly as she was. And maybe that was what it meant to be seen. It was supposed to be a celebration. The company's annual leadership gala, hosted in a glass-walled ballroom glowing with warm light and polished silver, was filled with laughter, champagne flutes, and the sharp scent of expensive perfume. Rachel had been invited as part of Ethan's executive team. She had spent the week rehearsing conversations in her head, picking out a borrowed navy gown, and learning how to carry herself like someone who belonged at a table lined with million-dollar smiles. For most of the evening, it almost felt real, until the moment that shattered everything. Near the dessert table, two well-dressed executives stood laughing quietly to themselves. Rachel passed them without much thought, until one of them, glancing sideways, leaned in and said just loud enough for her to hear, "So, saving the CEO from depression gets you a seat at the table now?" The other man chuckled. "Guess kindness really is a career path these days." Rachel froze. She didn't turn around, didn't confront them. She didn't need to. The words hit with the precision of a knife, clean, quiet, deep. She excused herself and slipped out into the hallway, her breath caught in her chest. Her heels clicked against marble until she found an empty alcove by the window. The city stretched beneath her, glittering and unfeeling. She had worked so hard to feel like she belonged, fought through self-doubt, grown into the space she'd been offered. But in that moment, it felt like all of it, every promotion, every small win, every moment of respect, had been reduced to pity, to proximity, to a rumor about being the girl who saved the boss. That night she returned home and wrote a letter. "You saved me from despair, but now I need to save myself from forgetting who I am." She left the note on Ethan's desk the next morning, before the office filled with footsteps and voices. Alongside it, her employee badge, coiled neatly like ribbon beside the envelope. She didn't wait for a reply. Rachel moved into a modest one-room apartment above a small bakery. No balcony, no air conditioning. But the rent was hers to pay. The chipped mugs and secondhand furniture were hers to choose. She enrolled in night classes at the local community college. Nonprofit management, business writing, digital literacy. In the mornings, she taught reading to children at a nearby women's shelter. In the afternoons, she took freelance data entry jobs to cover groceries and school supplies. Ethan reached out, quietly, respectfully. She didn't ignore him, but she made it clear, no favors, no scholarships, no shortcuts, not out of pride, out of purpose. Because she didn't want to be built by someone else's kindness. She wanted to be whole, on her own terms. They messaged occasionally, never sentimental, just small, human updates. "Tried that Thai place near your old apartment? Surprisingly good. Taught a kid to spell her name today. Took 4 tries. Worth every one. Discovered a word that means healing in progress. Will send it when I know how to pronounce it." In a strange way, their connection remained. Unspoken, unbroken, quietly understood. But Rachel had made her choice. She wasn't walking away from Ethan. She was walking toward herself. And if she was ever going to return to him, it would be not as the girl who once slipped him a folded note in the dark, but as a woman who had lit her own way back. 2 years later, Rachel Monroe stood beneath the warm lights of an auditorium stage. A hush fell over the crowd as she stepped up to the microphone, the modest navy dress she wore once belonging to her mother. Her hair was pinned simply, her notes tucked neatly into her hand. But she didn't need to read them. She knew this story by heart. Behind her was a banner for the Haven Initiative, a nonprofit she had built from scratch. It began with a borrowed classroom, 2 volunteers, and a stack of donated books. Now it spanned across the state, providing free literacy programs and mobile healthcare clinics for underserved women and single mothers. Rachel had worked day and night. She'd taught, fundraised, begged for grants, studied between bus rides, and now she was being honored. But the award wasn't the moment that made her heart pound. It was the quiet figure standing in the back row, away from the cameras and flowers. No spotlight, no announcement. Ethan Kingsley. He hadn't called, hadn't sent a message. But there he was, dressed simply in gray, his gaze steady, his presence like a held breath. Rachel continued her speech. She spoke not about herself, but about the women who had walked through the doors of her program. Women who had once believed they were invisible. Women who now held jobs, diplomas, and their own voices. The crowd stood to applaud when she finished. But as the clapping echoed around the room, her eyes found Ethan's. He didn't move, didn't wave. He just nodded. Later that evening, after the event had quieted, they found themselves walking side by side along the riverside path. The same path where Rachel had once wandered alone in the dark, questioning her place in the world. The sky above was clear now, scattered with stars. The air was cool, the river slow and silver in the moonlight. They said little at first. Their steps were in sync. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full, whole. Finally, she turned slightly, her voice soft. "I didn't expect you to be there." "I never stopped watching your work," Ethan replied. "You've built something extraordinary." She smiled, but it was hesitant. "There were nights I didn't think I'd make it through. I almost gave up." He looked at her, eyes calm but deep. "And yet, here you are." They paused near an old bench, the wood weathered from years of wind and rain. Rachel reached out and touched the top of it with her fingers, then turned to face him fully. "Do you still have it?" she asked. Ethan didn't speak. He just reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn, water-stained note, carefully folded, edges soft from years of being carried. "If you are still alive today, you are braver than you think." Rachel's breath caught. "I've carried it every day," he said quietly, "because it gave my life back to me." She reached for his hand. No rush, no tension. Just steady fingers sliding into his, like something inevitable. He didn't kiss her. She didn't ask him to. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her forehead. Tender, grounding, complete. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was a quiet promise. Not of forever, but of now. Of two people who had once met in darkness and now stood separately whole side by side. In the weeks that followed, Ethan returned to his work, this time not just as CEO, but as a mentor to young entrepreneurs, teaching ethical innovation and emotional leadership. He spoke about accountability, about quiet courage, and about the responsibility of building things that heal rather than harm. Rachel continued expanding the Haven Initiative. She launched new programs in rural communities and partnered with midwives and teachers to reach mothers in need. She spoke at universities. She coached girls who had grown up like her, girls who needed someone to say, "You matter exactly as you are." They didn't move in together. They didn't need to. But some nights a message would appear on each other's phones. Simple, small, sacred. Still here. Still brave. And sometimes on rainy evenings, they would meet at the old river path. No cameras, no speeches. Just two lives that had once brushed in silence and now chose fully, freely, to begin again. Not from chapter 1, but from chapter 2, as two whole people. In a world that often praises loud ambition and polished success, Rachel and Ethan's story reminds us that quiet courage still matters. Sometimes saving a life doesn't require grand gestures. It takes a simple act of kindness, a handwritten note, or the strength to truly see someone when they feel invisible. Their journey speaks to something deeply American, the belief in second chances, in rebuilding from the ground up, and in defining your worth not by where you start, but by how you choose to rise. Rachel didn't need rescue. She needed to remember her own power. Ethan didn't need fixing. He needed someone to believe he was still worth saving. Together, they didn't complete each other. They made space for one another to become whole. And maybe that's the truest kind of love. But what about you? Have you ever received or given a small gesture that changed everything? Do you believe people can truly reinvent themselves after being broken? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Let's talk about the brave ones you've met, or the moments that made you braver than you thought. Thank you for spending time with this story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of something real in your own life, we invite you to like the video, subscribe to Warm Soul Stories, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next journey of love, hope, and healing. Because sometimes the smallest words echo the loudest. And if you're still here, still holding on, you are already braver than you think.